give ample time for questions and discussion as well. So I have a small presentation to put together, and let me just start that, make sure that this works. Can you see this okay? Excellent. Okay. So I'll be giving an overview of the book. I want to intersperse that with a few commentaries on putting the book together itself, which I think are relevant to some of the decisions I made about critique of things like concept of origins. And also because when the author is able to come and speak to all of you, I think it's a nice opportunity to talk about some of the behind the scenes activity that went on in putting a book like this together. So again, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this. This first image actually is Thucydides and Herodotus, and it's the image I originally wanted for the book. And that's because it got at a central piece of what I was trying to drive at in revisiting gospel literature as what I say often in the book as normal Greco-Roman literature, which is that when we imagine the activity of authors in the ancient world, we do tend to think about publication processes, processes of education, processes of writing culture as something that is generally between what I term elite cultural producers. Now, to be clear in the book, I don't say elite cultural producers to mean an economic elite necessarily. As we all know, there are certainly enslaved populations that were educated enough to function as literate producers within their household or other contexts. But what I wanted to re-examine were these concrete historical processes of authorship, because I found that there were often many assumptions made about the social context of gospel authors comparatively within the scope of Greco-Roman literature. The eventual cover of the book captured this in a way, because what you have here are beyond the synoptic gospel authors kind of in a social distancing posture, which was, this was pre-pandemic actually when this was selected. So it just happened to be kind of a humorous addition to any kind of meaning that you would derive from this image. But what you have here is the passage of the cleansing of the temple side by side between the synoptic authors. And here what you see is perhaps, as the history of Christianity has authorized, a vision of three authors giving a version of an oral tradition that they have received from some origin point of Christianity. Alternatively, what you might see visualized here is the competition and exchange of three authors, all giving a different version of the same story. And so the title, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, actually was not the title that I submitted the manuscript with. The title that I submitted the manuscript with was The Beginnings of Early Christian Literature, because I really wanted to get back to this idea of how can we imagine not an origin point that then expands, exponentially with the explosion, conversion, and what we might consider other sort of missionary and religious aspects of early Christianity, but one that focuses on this tier, the social tier of authorship. And while I couldn't necessarily authorize any of the concrete ideas and assumptions that we bring to ideas of oral tradition or community formation, which I'll talk about in a minute, to early Christianity, what I could describe were the activities of authors in the ancient world. So I wanted to get back to comparing the activities of authors in terms of, again, education, networks of exchange and publication with what we tend to find, at least challenging what we tend to find in the narrative of early Christianity. So let me turn to that for a moment. So I know all of you know this story, but it bears repeating to just at the very least give you some idea of my own presumptions going into this project. So the traditional story about early Christianity and Christian origins is that Jesus lived, preached to relatively local and limited populations within Galilee and then moving into Jerusalem, but within Judea, of what we might consider a peasant class of individuals. That these audiences, including his disciples, heard his message and found it so important, so wondrous, that they held on to the oral version of those stories and passed them along. And that after Jesus' death at some point, maybe one or two generations later, the gospel authors, as spokesmen, representatives of a community of people who over the generations had passed on these sayings, teachings, anecdotes about Jesus, his miracle working, his wonder working, etc., finally wrote them down and that these stories were representative of the communities for which these spokespersons were either hired or a member of a church community. So whichever configuration a scholar decides to go with, these are essentially spokesmen, literate spokesmen for a Christian community of some sort, passing along an oral tradition. And then, of course, again, this is necessary in some ways because the story of Jesus is that he does have certain disciples, students, who listen to his teachings and his messages and follow him along and continue his activity after his death, but they're largely from also peasant populations or working populations like fishermen. So these are not people who traditionally, socially would have the education, the paideia, or the ability to read and write, to publish, and to circulate writings. So by necessity, to the extent that we treat the Gospels as giving us some kind of reliable history of Jesus, his activities, his followers, and his audiences, they are by necessity illiterate persons, given their social location. Now, if we think about the canon overall, and again, I know that you all know this, but just to give you some of my assumptions going into this project, what we have other than the Gospels in the canon and a variety of other texts, but principally the letters of Paul. Now, Paul is important because he represents, of course, our earliest evidence, written evidence, for what we call early Christianity or the Jesus movement. But Paul himself also never knew the historical Jesus. He hardly, in fact, speaks about the historical Jesus in his life, with a few exceptions. He talks about, that the Lord said, "Do not commit adultery." He talks about, James and Peter. There are a few other the Last Supper, although what we call the Last Supper, he describes as something that he received from a divination experience of the risen Christ. So to the extent that that's actually historical, we can debate. But Paul did not know the historical Jesus, does not seem to care much about the historical Jesus. He seems to care much more about the risen Christ. And he describes his own authority deriving from the fact that he repeatedly sees the risen Christ in divination experiences and recognizes him as the predicted Jewish Messiah. And he travels around the Mediterranean, as we all know, trying to coalesce certain groups of Gentiles around this idea that the Jewish Messiah has come, and as predicted, a certain measure of Gentiles will return to the fold in order to usher in a new age. But these groups to whom Paul speaks are variously bounded, what we might call actually cohesive communities. So of course, the Corinthians are notoriously a bit scattered in their interests and their activities. The Romans he never met. Or at least we don't know that. He was hoping his last letter to go to Rome and meet whatever group was there. The Galatians seem a little bit more in his graces, although he still has some harsh words for them because they are listening to his competitors about circumcision. So what we have through Paul is a picture of a landscape that's highly contested, that is by no means as cohesive as we might like. And although we use the word church for ecclesia and tend to adopt ideas of cohesive community when we speak of the groups to whom Paul is writing, that I think is something that a lot of scholars now put into contention. And the important thing too about thinking of Paul as a foundational figure and how his letters have been used, especially within canon, is that we have a methodology for reading Paul, understandably because of the nature of how he is writing. He's writing occasional letters, of reconstructing the communities, again, to which Paul is writing. We have just enough information about the things that they're doing, the people they're listening to, the activities they're performing, to say this is what this community was like. There's something like that, I think, going on then in our treatment of the Gospels. As long as we can reconstruct Pauline communities, why can't we reconstruct the communities we presume are also represented by the Gospels? But of course, there are a few things to keep in mind. One is that we have about 2 generations between Jesus's activities and when the Gospels are first written. And I say 2 generations because of life expectancy being on average about 22, 23 years old, because of plague, because of war, because of childbirth. Certainly people lived longer than this. But you are thinking about 20, if you're thinking about 20 years per generation, then you are thinking about 2 generations between Jesus's activities and the earliest date that we give to the first of the Synoptic Gospels. In between that, again, you have Paul's quote unquote ministry, where he is clearly part of this literate elite that I am trying to identify insofar as his letters represent, as a Pharisee, represent his exceptional knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, of the Septuagint specifically, but also his knowledge of Stoicism and Middle Platonism. And so much like Philo, much like Josephus, he is writing in a period of the first century in which, as a Jewish writer, he is incorporating a number of elements from both Greco-Roman literature, Greco-Roman philosophy, and the Septuagint into his interpretations of, in this case, the significance of Christ. You have the Jewish War. Paul seems to drop off the map. There are certain traditions about him, but we don't know for sure what happened to him. But then you have the Jewish War, and after that, there is something about that war that helps to inspire the Gospels then being written. And there was actually another chapter in this book that I ended up cutting for length, delving into that, and that's something I'm happy to talk more about if anyone wants to hear more about it. But the question of why now is an interesting one. And certainly there are some arguments that can be made that after the displacement of war, there's a desire to take those oral traditions that are so rife within Judea and to record them now. That's possible, although that doesn't tend to correspond terribly well with the idea of already pre-existent cohesive communities, Markan community, Matthean community, Lucan community, wherever they happen to be. And usually they're imagined throughout the Mediterranean world. So there's a little bit of messiness there. But we do use the oral tradition theory as one way to create a bit of a ladder from that post-war scenario or context in which you have the Gospels being written back to the age of Christ, the historical Jesus. And so what I often tell my students is that would be like thinking about the timeline that we give for the development of the synoptics. Of course, you have Mark first and right dead on 70. Then you have Matthew about 10 years later, Luke about 10 years after that. That would be like us writing about World War II or the Beatles or Elvis or the Bee Gees for the first time now, depending on how you slide that scale. So on a very practical level, that seems like you're putting a lot of weight on the concept of oral tradition. I don't try to say that oral tradition doesn't exist, but I do try to point out some of the problems with trying to hang the entirety of the Gospels on the idea that they're preserving something historical with oral tradition. And so oral tradition for me does serve a certain purpose in trying to traverse again that gap, of those generational gaps between historical Jesus and the period in which you actually find the writing activity of the Gospel authors. But when you mine down into what that process probably looked like, oral tradition, I think, gets even increasingly more troublesome. So if we look at Luke, the introduction to Luke, and he's really the only gospel writer that gives us an idea into his process. He talks about how many, and of course he has his patron Theophilus, he talks about how many have sat down to write an orderly account of that which had been fulfilled. And then he does say, just as it was handed on from those who were eyewitnesses, and then he decides, after considering everything carefully, to write an authoritative account for his patron Theophilus. Now, a lot of people do take this preface, and I can understand why, to say, well, here oral tradition is affirmed. He's speaking to eyewitnesses. Now, of course, this is a formula that we see quite often back to Thucydides and Herodotus with many authors in this period, and obviously predating the production of the Gospels, whenever that happened to be in the late first or some even say second century. This is a formula that we see from both historians and authors who write biography, who are trying to authorize their account. So the idea that one would claim that they've spoken to eyewitnesses as a way to authorize what's to come after is an indication of genre. But it's a genre that agitates against our contemporary understandings of what historicity means. And what I mean by that is, and I have a couple of slides that I might skip, but jumping ahead to someone like Plutarch writing a life of Alexander, he'll say something along the lines of, I'm going to tell you some of the small deeds that Alexander committed instead of some of these larger battles, because I want to give you an impression of the man, even if the things I'm about to tell you are not exactly true. What's true is the impression I give you of the man, not so much the minute detail and historical facts of the individual in a systematic fashion. Similarly, someone like Herodotus will say, yeah, I spoke to eyewitnesses about X, Y, and Z, and then go ahead and give some kind of fantastic claim about, he has all kinds of claims about different ethnicities and how they even perform bodily functions that we know are not accurate. And so we know that even though he's claiming he is himself as an eyewitness, or he has spoken to eyewitnesses of a particular event, often they are so fantastic that it's understood that he is just trying to give an impression of a region, or trying to tell a bit of a tall tale about a region for entertainment purposes, that we're not hanging on to every minute detail as something that has been, checked, cross-checked, footnoted, not plagiarized, given some kind of authorization through the standards that we would expect today. And so I think that when we read Luke, he is acting very much like a traditional Greco-Roman author writing within a genre of biography, or writing perhaps even, one might argue, in a genre of history by making this kind of claim. And so it gives us an interesting foil, again, to the oral tradition theory insofar as the practicality of oral tradition, because oral tradition is a bit like a game of telephone for anyone who's ever played it. So I often do this with my students. I'll whisper, have them in a circle and whisper a line from, say, the Gospel of Thomas to them, and then see how it comes out after, 30, 40 people at the other end. And I don't think it's ever come out exactly the right way. And also, I have a little slide here for those who know the movie. There's a bit of a lost in translation element too, when you think about oral tradition traveling from the historical Jesus to the pen of the gospel author, in part because you have an active translation right from the get-go. Jesus is speaking Aramaic, again, speaking to very local, very limited populations. He's also not the only person who's claiming that he is a son of God, or others are considering possibly the Messiah or a son of God, depending on our sources, including sources like Josephus. So that first act of translation, to go from Jesus in Aramaic to, as we know, the Gospels being written in Koine Greek, you have to go through a number of processes of translation, but also, again, recognizing how limited literacy was in the ancient world. There are only a small number of people who would have been able to record down anything that was being circulated orally. Now, literacy rates in antiquity is also something I raise in the book. I lean a bit on Catherine Hetzer's work on this. But those who say that it's 10 to 20%, I think are being a bit generous, and it depends on what you mean by literacy. If you mean that someone can sign a contract with their own signature and that counts as literacy, that's one thing. But to be able to actually sit down and write relatively complicated prose narrative is something that was, I think, probably the purview of something more along the lines of about 4% of the population in the first century. And prose narrative is also important there too, because Jesus does not speak in verse generally, as far as we can tell. And oral tradition, something like Homer, for the most part, travels in verse, not in prose. So this is another issue for thinking about the how solid the foundation of oral tradition can be considered. Then, of course, you have the questions of form of the Gospels, and something I'm happy to talk about further. I have a section about anonymity in the Gospels and how they're being written in particular ways, not attributed to an author per se, but that itself can be perceived as a literary strategy to authorize a certain narrative in antiquity. And then the question of why now looms large in this question. But thinking about all of this and feeling that there were twin problems with the way that we tend to reconstruct the social conditions and the social formation that brings about the early Christian Gospels, I really wanted to, again, look at, if I cannot prove for certain that oral tradition is the foundation of what we find in the Gospels, again, maybe partly an influence, but maybe one that has been overdetermined to this point, just in terms of function and what we know about oral tradition theory. And if I don't want to presume that there are cohesive communities for every single text in the New Testament, while we, again, deploy that for the letters of Paul, are there good reasons for deploying it for the Gospels other than our desire to know more about the quote unquote origins of Christianity, or know more about the supposed communities that are represented by each one of these texts? What are my alternatives? And so my project began with, I do come from a classics background. So I wanted to begin from the perspective of, if I make none of these assumptions about the social conditions of authorship for the Gospels, what do I know concretely about the historical processes of authors, and how does that correspond to what I find in the Gospels? And I came up with a bit of a different perspective on how to imagine not just the social conditions of authorship for the Gospels. Of course, I'm leaning on some practical aspects of authorship in antiquity with that premise. But I was also trying to get at more about what is the most formative influence on the Gospel authors. Is it oral tradition and community, or is it the training, the specialization, and the social networks that come from being an elite literate producer, that come from being among that, let's say, 4% of the ancient world that has had enough paideia, enough education, enough, to some extent, financial means are definitely a factor here, although I tried to extract economics from the idea of being culturally elite because of enslaved populations. But if that 4% of individuals capable of this, what is their social location and what are their norms for social networking and social exchange? Because that may be the more formative social network for what we find, the content of the Gospels, more so than the presumption of community. And so if that is the case, if it is the case that training, specialization, other networks of elite authors are what will be more formative for the Gospel authors, another element of what I had to get at in this book, and this is what I approach in chapter 2, is if it turns out that's the case, as it is for the majority of the rest of classics, why is New Testament, the study of the New Testament, the study of early Christianity, why are these texts treated so differently within our field versus allied fields like classics? Why are we suggesting that communities author texts, that oral tradition authors texts in the case of the Gospels, for which the Gospel author is merely a spokesperson with really no agency of their own? I talk a little bit about death of the author in this book too. So, accepting and deploying a theory of the death of the author who speaks for a community of people. Why are we assuming that when we don't assume it about, say, Philo? We don't talk about the Philonic community. We don't talk about Philodemus's community, right? Communities don't author text normally, authors author text. So why do we treat the New Testament differently? And to answer that question, I tried to go back to the history of the field itself and our inherited methodologies, including the methodologies that we've inherited from the Romantic period. And no one will be surprised that this is the direction I went, given the history of our field, which not only arose in continental Europe, as well as the UK, of course, but principally the critical study of the New Testament was greatly influenced by activities within the German Academy during the Romantic era. And so the book does go all the way back to really the 17th century, 18th century, but I'm principally interested in developments in the 19th century within the Academy in Germany. And that corresponded with a rise in nationalism, given the political situation in Germany and its unification, and a desire within Germany at the time to develop methods that allowed the German people to reclaim their oral traditions. So those who know a little bit more about this movement in Germany, and I'll explain it briefly, these are the Grimm brothers. And I like to use them as an example of what I'm talking about because almost everybody is familiar with their work. So at a period when Germany is struggling with its unification and with reclaiming some kind of, or in their mind, reclaiming some kind of idea of an origin story for themselves, and one specifically that rivals Rome, and I'll talk about that in one moment, but in looking for some kind of tradition that can rival that of Greco-Roman antiquity, one strategy was to go back to the quote unquote oral stories of the peasant classes of Germany to find and rediscover there something about what is in German called the essential spirit or Geist of the people, of the folk. And so how can we mine the oral stories of the folk to reclaim the Geist, the spirit of the people? So this is where we get, many of the stories I often, tell people, I kind of aged out of the Disney thing, in the early 90s. But before that, many of those stories were stories that were collected by the Grimm brothers. So things like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Hansel and Gretel. Many of us know many of these, what we might call folk tales or fairy tales. These were collected along with some other stories that ended up being forged, that were supposed to be, you know, these great sort of like Homeric poets of Germania. In a period, again, that rivals Rome. Now, the problem is the Brothers Grimm, for those who know anything about their methods, they were trained to an extent. They were not elite academics. They were very good at creating letter writing campaigns against their perceived enemies, and they were very popular for the books that they produced. But their methods for reclaiming the Geist of the people for these folk tales were a little bit suspect. They would basically kind of, you know, like ask a girlfriend or things like that. They were not doing the kind of intensive field work. It was more armchair field work to reclaim these stories. So, you know, whatever they were reclaiming were not, you know, the word for word oral traditions of a German people, but they served their purpose, which was as a method to try to come up with some kind of competing story to give an idea of a history, an oral history for the German people. I mentioned Rome a second ago. The other objective that we see when we read the writings of some of these people like the Brothers Grimm and others doing similar work is an anxiety, especially among the Protestant classes who primarily populated the academic ranks, especially in the latter half of the 19th century. So the Protestant anxiety with ideas of Roman excess, particularly their conflicts with papal authority. And again, this idea that Rome so dominates the historical imaginary of the classical world that other than, you know, a few texts about the conquering of Germania, what did they have from the early, you know, from the first centuries CE to represent the German people? And so there was an idea that the Germans wanted to compete or supplant somehow the cultural dominance of Rome, particularly in light of contemporary disagreements between Protestant and Catholic authority in the period. So there are many motivations for coming up with a methodology to reclaim the oral traditions and the Geist of long lost peoples of the first century. And if I could just go back to my first slide here of the academy. Now, in this period, we also don't have strong disciplinary boundaries within the academy. So someone might publish on the oral history of the German people and then write, you know, a critical treatise that was critiquing the New Testament. So the idea that the methodologies of oral tradition, of Geist, of a spokesman, you know, the great poet, the romantic poet speaking for the people was rife within Germany in this period, and something that was deployed in the critical study of the New Testament, and something, to my mind, that stuck. The other example I can give you that is a little bit counterintuitive that I talk about in the book is that for the Germans, Shakespeare was quite important as a romantic genius who spoke for the people. That might seem a little counterintuitive. You know, why would the Germans try to co-opt Shakespeare of all people as representative of a romantic poet? But the idea was that Shakespeare channeled all of these stories that they considered oral traditions of the quote unquote low-lived Elizabethan. So the idea that you can reclaim the stories of the peasant class was something that we saw again throughout this period, this romantic period, in terms of scholarly approach. So what I posit in the book is that we are not too many generations away from the generations in Germany doing that kind of work and the methodologies of today within the field of New Testament early Christian studies. This is not evidence necessarily because it's a little bit anecdotal in my own life, but one of my own professors at Harvard was a student of Bultmann, was a German professor who was a student of Bultmann. And I talk about both Bultmann, my professor was Helmut Kester. So Helmut Kester and Bultmann, you know, still in my generation, you know, Kester was still teaching the methodologies of Bultmann. That's what I was initially trained in when I turned from classics to New Testament. So again, a little bit anecdotal, but only to say that, you know, there are still many generations today, working today, who were trained in the same way by scholars who were only 1-2 generations away from people like Herder and others that I speak of in the book, who are deploying these same kind of methods for the New Testament. So again, just to kind of rehash, I'm skeptical of methodologies that reconstruct community and authorize the idea of the gospel authors as literate spokesmen. I'm skeptical of this because of, comparative methods and classics that seem to have moved on from this kind of mentality, because these texts are not written in verse, because oral tradition theory, I think, has been overdetermined, because I think that there's a bit of an obsession with Christian origin and a fallback to methodologies deployed for other texts like Paul, that tends to see early Christianity as more expansive, cohesive. I call it the early Christian Big Bang, more expansive, cohesive, and well-formed than perhaps they really were. Just in terms of social development and social networking in the early centuries of the Jesus movement. So I want to compare then these texts to what we know about publication processes. I've started to debunk in the book, at least to my mind, why we continue to deploy methodologies that authorize a romantic genius, a literate spokesman for peasant communities, which is what I seem to, or at least I detect happening in early Christian strategies and methodologies. So I turned to Roman education and publication processes to, again, try to reconstruct a social network for early Christian authors that do not depend on community and do not depend on these methodologies inherited from German Romanticism. And so I've already talked about this passage from Luke, and so I did kind of anticipate myself a little bit speaking earlier, but I'm trying to then quote unquote normalize the gospel authors within a scope of the production of literature that adheres to certain genre expectations, that takes on certain characteristics representative of its location within the fabric of Greco-Roman literary production of the 1st and 2nd centuries. So for Luke, that includes things like looking very much like a typical ancient biography or ancient history. I mentioned Plutarch a minute ago. Plutarch, his beginning of life of Alexander the Great, makes a very similar statement to what we find in Luke, that he's writing this book on the multitude of deeds, on the actions of famous men, and devoting himself to portray the life of each. And he's looking at those, again, minor points in the life of these individuals to give an impression, in this case, Alexander, of the man, of what these great individuals were like. And he says in a very compelling passage, it is not histories that I'm writing, but lives, where he says the most illustrious deeds are not always a manifestation of virtue and vice. But this idea of writing histories, not writing lives, these lines between genres, this is something that I explore in the book. I ultimately come to the conclusion in a piece that the last chapter of the book is built off of a piece that I wrote with David Constan, that the Gospels themselves look very much like a tradition of what we call subversive biography that develops in this period, where you do take these lives of great individuals, of heroic men, usually men, who get to that status through unconventional means. And certainly there are lives of Alexander where, in Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great, he's a known drunkard. He often gets by in his wits or his ability to wonder work or perform miraculous deeds, versus just kind of being a statesman, a virtuous statesman, or someone who gets by virtue of his brawn alone. So that tradition, Aesop also falls, I think, within that tradition. And some of the later Christian lives also fall into this tradition, this genre tradition that looks at a subversive kind of biography of a famous character from history. And so I explore that in the book. And then the other thing that I do is try to say, well, if these Gospels are not being informed if they're being informed by genre expectation, they're not being informed principally by things like oral tradition, then there has to be evidence in the text for literary overlap with other kinds of interests, particularly interests in, say, the second sophistic, or interests that we see arise in something like the Greek novel. There has to be evidence of engagement with literate culture, and that has to be beyond just the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint. And I'm not new in saying this. Many scholars have said this before, have done comparisons, particularly you mentioned that I come from the stable of Stanley Stowers. Many of my cohort have written, and I mentioned it previously, on Paul and his use of Middle Platonic philosophy, what's usually called Middle Platonic philosophy. I have a colleague, Aaron Roberts, who is about to publish a book with Oxford on Matthew as a Stoic document. And usually Matthew's characterized quite differently as a quote unquote Jewish gospel, but she demonstrates that its engagement with Stoic doctrine, particularly on the doctrine of anger, demonstrates that its author is that Matthew is quite well aware of Stoic doctrine. So there are also many people, including David Constant too, who have written about the Gospels and some of the literary aspects that share in common elements from, again, history, from biography. But I wanted to look at evidence of literate cultural exchange on the level of something like the Greek novel or other kinds of literature. So not quote unquote sacred literature, not oral tradition, but other kinds of literature we see out in the ether in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And one example that I give in the book is a comparison between the Gospels and the Satyricon. Now, traditionally, the Satyricon is attributed to a figure within the household of Nero, or considered possibly anonymous, but there have been recent articles within classics, particularly from Ulrike Roth in the Classical Quarterly, making a very compelling case that this is an anonymous text from the 2nd century from someone in the social circle of Pliny. And now this is the same Pliny writing letters to Trajan about so-called Christians in his midst and how to take care of them or address the issue of their obstinacy, which he's doing through execution, evidently. If they are particularly obstinate. But this same Pliny seems to have some kind of colleague or someone in his network, his literate network, who is aware of his letters or his correspondence, because this person in the Satyricon is quoting aspects or at least lists from Pliny's letters, including a list of slaves that Pliny manumits appear in the Satyricon in the same order, the same names. So there have been some compelling pieces done lately saying that this is a 2nd century document, that its attribution to in the 1st century has been mistaken. And looking at the Satyricon, it's an interesting text in that it amalgamates a number of things, including incorporating in it something like Ephesian tales and other kinds of stories that we might expect to see in something like the Greek novel that are out, again, in the ether. So I returned to the Satyricon for a few reasons, but my premise was that if I'm saying that the Gospels are normal Greco-Roman literature that are not just circulating within Christian ambits, because they're recording some kind of Christian speech or oral tradition, then I would expect other people to be reading them from outside of Christianity, or I would expect to see more evidence of the Gospels engaging with literate culture outside of what we might call a Christian circle or a Christian community. And I think I have found that in the Satyricon. Although I preface that with, I am very careful in the book to say that I actually, the chicken and egg argument of what comes first, the Gospels or the Satyricon, I'm a bit agnostic about, because I don't think I could ever prove it. So I don't know if the Satyricon is a satirizing Christianity or something like the Gospels, or if the Gospels have read the Satyricon, I don't know. But what I see there are shared thematic elements that I think are important, because it demonstrates that there are shared thematic literary devices that are out there, again, in the ether, that were accessible to anyone with the correct education level, paideia, and ability to put together the kind of text that the Gospels represent. So I'll give you a few examples. You have, of course, the anointing of Jesus before his death, where I quoted Mark here, it's just one example, that he's the woman who anoints his body before his burial. In the Satyricon, and I apologize for having too much text on these slides, but I just wanted to give you a fulsome account of this. In the Satyricon, Trimalchio also invites some dinner guests to his funeral, and there is an anointing that takes place as well at the dinner table for Trimalchio. Elsewhere in the dinner party for Trimalchio, he says that he wants to give his beneficiaries his will and testament. And he says he'll only do it under one condition, that they divide his body into parts and eat it after his death. And he advises his friends to not refuse what he orders, but to eat his body with the same enthusiasm that they have cursed his spirit. So not only does he have an anointing, a funerary anointing before a funerary meal for himself, but his testament is that he wants his friends to divide and eat his body at that supper. A cock also happens to crow not only in the Synoptic Gospels as a prognostication of what's about to come for Jesus and his execution, but the same thing happens for Trimalchio, although in a much more humorous context. A cock crows and he panics and says, basically find the chicken and let's cook it. But a cock crows and he sees that as a prognostication of his death. So in just that Trimalchio scene, you have a figure who anointed before his death, has a funerary meal, wants his body divided and eaten, and a cock crowing predicts the coming events. So overlap, obviously, between what we see in the Satyricon for this particular figure and then what happens for Jesus. Then there's also the account of the widow of Ephesus, which I also find compelling. Now, the widow of Ephesus is an Ephesian tale, so predates both the Gospels and what we find in the Satyricon, but it's an interesting story, the premise of which is that there is a Roman guard who's been tasked with guarding the 3 crucified men who are up on a hill. So 3 men have been crucified. This Roman guard has been tasked with guarding the bodies to make sure no one comes to take them down off the cross. While he's guarding these bodies, he hears a woman weeping inside a tomb. He rolls back the stone and there's a widow crying over the body of her dead husband along with her maid. He takes pity on her and joins her in the tomb. They get food and wine. Long story short, he ends up being her boyfriend before the end of 3 days and 3 nights together in the tomb. At the end of 3 days and 3 nights, eating wine and eating in the tomb, the Roman soldier emerges with his new girlfriend and discovers that a body has been taken down off one of the crosses. And that is tantamount to a death sentence for him, that he has abandoned his post. So they take the body of the widow's dead husband and put him on the cross instead to save the Roman soldier's life. And the widow of Ephesus story here ends with this, some kind of saying along the lines of, better to make a dead man useful than to get a live man in trouble. So consequently, the tomb is left empty. And so the widow of Ephesus story, between the crucifixion of 3 men, the Roman soldier, 3 days, 3 nights in the tomb, the rolling back of the stone, many of the same, again, thematic elements that we find obviously in the Synoptic Gospels and the account of the aftermath of Jesus' death are replicated, at least thematically, with this particular story. And then there's the empty tomb itself. And for that, again, sorry to give you quite a bit of text, but as we know, the ending of Mark, the original ending of Mark, the women go to the tomb, they see that the stone is rolled back, that it is empty, they're struck with fear and amazement, and they run away and say nothing to anyone. And then, of course, this is not the proper ending to a gospel that's supposed to supposed to be an explication for how Christianity then spreads throughout the empire. So we know that there is a longer ending, but this was the original ending to the Gospel of Mark, that these women see the stone rolled back, the tomb is empty, they're afraid, and they run away. This is also a theme that is the empty tomb motif, or the motif of the missing body, is exceptionally common throughout literature in the Greco-Roman period, including in the Greek novel. So again, pardon the text, the great deal of text here, but in Chariton's novel, there is the scene in which the 2 lovers, Chaereas goes, he searches the tomb and cannot find his lover, or his intended lover, who has actually been kidnapped by pirates. But he looks up to the sky and curses the heavens, assuming that the empty tomb means that his beloved is now a god. This idea of the apotheosis of individuals, we know, is particularly common in imperial imagery. I showed you earlier some images from the Arch of Titus, which we all know has the apotheosis of Titus in the arch. But I give something like at least 35 solid examples, if not more, of literary examples. And also, if you add on examples from so-called material culture, that number goes up exponentially. But many examples of the idea that to have an empty tomb indicates deification. And so as a literary strategy, that the tomb remained empty may not be a commentary on the historical Jesus per se, but could be a commentary on, as a writer, how do I indicate that he has now achieved a deified status while I have to demonstrate bodily resurrection? which is something that, again, we're seeing in the novel, that we're seeing in something like arguably the Satyricon, that we see, again, multiple examples throughout Greco-Roman literature. So less a description of the historical Jesus and an oral tradition that has been passed down from these women who fled the tomb in the Synoptic Gospels, something like this more likely could be characterized as literary strategy and something borrowed from learned practices and learned literary techniques from Paideia on behalf of the gospel authors. Okay, let me stop there. So that's a basic overview of the book. Let me make this full screen on my side. And I'm happy to answer any other questions that you have. I'm also happy to talk to you about what I think I did wrong. I'm not bashful about that, but I'm interested to get your feedback and hear a larger discussion. So thank you for the time.
Well, thank you so much, Robyn, for a splendid presentation of your project and also clarifying the underlying assumptions. So that's absolutely great. Thank you so much. So there are quite a few people here in the room, but also on Zoom. So I suggest that we alternate between room and Zoom. If people in Zoom could indicate the questions, their interest through the chat, I try to note that. Is there any question starting here from the room? It's well, perhaps to open the discussion. Of course, I'm very sympathetic to your work, Robyn, and read your book with great interest. So entirely by the entire argument about the importance of literary culture. But what about the antithesis that you've seen also today, perhaps in your presentation, the antithesis that you developed between, on the one hand, historical and real, versus literary, generic, and rhetorical, so, you know, the literary tropes. Of course, Cambridge, UK, is also the place of Wittgenstein, and to some extent, it doesn't surprise me that perhaps I'm even more radical, that all our language is embedded in language, all our descriptions are embedded in language, aren't they? That's the language that is available to us. So does there need to be, just to probe you, does there need to be that kind of antithesis that you're developing between historical and literary? For instance, you know, common day example, Putin is currently described in the international press as a particular type of politician, and also the entourage around him as you know, exhibiting a particular form of governing. Those are all tropes, aren't they? But they are also real. So perhaps can you, at least that reflect my own view, not to politicize the seminar, but the point that I'm making is, can you reflect perhaps, I really understand that you need to downplay the reliability and even the relevance of orality, but in the end, if we all adopt your paradigm of the importance of literary culture, is there then still need to question or to exemplify and develop this antithesis between the literary and the historical?
That's an excellent question, because one thing that I tried to do in this book, although it's not terribly overt, it comes out a little in the second chapter, is that I am coming from a realist tradition and not a structuralist tradition necessarily. I'm trying to, you know, this is my critique of Barth, right? So I'm trying to move away from the idea that language constructs reality. And so to get into some kind of realist tradition, that's why I go back to this idea of what are the historical circumstances of authorship. So rather than come from a perspective that makes the presumption that the text corresponds to reality. So this is why I emphasize that, you know, he's ministering to peasant communities and his followers are fishermen. Therefore, they are illiterate. Therefore, they can't, you can't make any claim later on when the canon is being developed that these texts were written by those people themselves, right? You can't make that claim because it's demonstrably false. So my issue, and I'm completely sympathetic to the question, is only that by focusing more on a realist tradition, I'm offering a bit of a corrective to the social development of Christianity that presumes things like its cohesion and what I call that is early Christian Big Bang, that conversion, the idea of conversion, of mission, that these things were as black and white as they tend to be portrayed in our scholarship, and that it's much more of an interesting conflict between what we might consider that elite cultural class and the people we think being represented by those texts. If it's the case that the Gospels are being written by the 4%, right, and using some combination, again, I don't dismiss the idea that they know some Christians. That would be a little bit extreme for me to say that they're not Christian at all, or they don't know other Jesus followers, or they're not part of some ecclesia. They have this information from, or an interest in this topic from somewhere. But that's not the most formative thing for the text itself. For the text itself, the more formative elements are those constraints, the historical constraints of authorship, which include things like writing within genre expectation, which include things like deploying literary trope for your own authorization as a writer in antiquity that shows that you know the literature that's of the time period, that you know how to write a compelling narrative based on the things that people are reading, that are being exchanged among that elite class of literate producers. Those kinds of constraints, I think, are more formative for the content in the Gospels. That's why I liked the Satyricon piece in the book a little bit, because if you can prove that whoever wrote the Satyricon is in the circle of Pliny, and Pliny is complaining about Christians, then all of a sudden that puts, who's writing these texts into an entirely different light. Because as long as we just imagine that they are the spokesman of Christian communities and have that one kind of narrative assumption that I do think comes from Romantic tradition, what would it mean if these Gospels are being written by elites, by cultural elites? That is not the image we have of Christian origins. And I think it's an exciting alternative. I think it offers many different tracks for scholarship to take, if that's the case, for us to try to situate these gospel authors historically in that more realist tradition of what were the techne that were involved in publication and writing, without assuming anything about these other classes of people being represented behind the text. And then back to the question of, I asked the question of myself, but what correctives I would bring to the book. I do think the work of people like Candida Massa, she's begun, that's also forthcoming, on trying to locate enslaved literate workers who were the ones who took dictation from many of the authors that we think about within both the classical tradition and possibly from this tradition of gospel writing. If we can locate their voices, that is incredibly exciting and a very, again, different social dynamic for the beginnings of Christianity that I think would bring a lot more specificity, but a lot more interest into how we reconstruct the ancient world. Does that help?
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's very helpful, Robyn. There's a question on Zoom from Professor Casper Groot-Larsen from Aarhus. So we are being joined by Denmark, our correspondent in Denmark.
Thank you very much. Thanks for a good read and a nice presentation as well. I have two questions. The first one goes to another one of your, could we call them dichotomies between individual writing and communal writing. It seems to me that we as New Testament scholars seem to divide ourselves into the Greco-Romans and the Jewish scholars in terms of the context that we use for understanding the New Testament. And well, it seems to me that the New Testament texts have clear signs of first-person plurals, we's, and admonitions to community. And the Qumran writings, aren't they written by a community? I think you said that communities do not produce literature, and does that mean, community-produced literature can still be communicating with literary culture? It doesn't have to be a dichotomy, I think. So that was one question. How do you look on that? And the second one is regards you said that you needed to show that there is engagement with literary culture in the Gospels, and I certainly agree with that. And you did that by pointing at particular parallels. To me, that would be a similar way of working than you can see in Dennis MacDonald's work, for example, his mimesis criticism, and also in our host, George van Groten's work, showing parallels between the Gospel of John and Plato's dialogues, for example. Mm-hmm. But is it necessary to be so specific? Can't you discuss the engagement with literary culture in terms of genre and tropes in a more broad sense, and still have the look at the Gospels as engaging with literary culture?
So as to your first question, it's an excellent one. I mean, Qumran is an interesting case, of course, because they are somewhat isolated in their interests and in their location. You know, having been there too, you know, this is a place where they're, you know, subsisting in relative isolation. Even then, the people producing the text will have certain constraints that have to do with authorship. But I take your point about community authorship in the sense that it's representing an entire group. That's not what I see evidence for in the Gospels, however, because of their engagement with the literate Greco-Roman culture around them. I don't see evidence of, and it's a story. It's a biography of someone. It's not, you know, the production of certain kinds of codes for a community living. You can extrapolate from that text to some extent that those elements are there, but there's more going on with those texts than representing communal interests, to my mind, including the ways in which they diverge in their storytelling. There may be some core stories that are shared, particularly between the synoptics, obviously, but even in that case, they're sharing, the way that they share those stories may be evidence of writers exchanging texts to tell different versions, what they consider their better version of one biography of one individual, which we obviously have ample evidence for in antiquity. So I definitely do take your point and understand that there is that precedent, arguably, of something like Qumran, but I just don't see the gospel text as being that narrow in its interest or purpose. So that's obviously a point that we can continue to dispute. As for the second question about parallels, in the book, although in this presentation I gave the example from the Satyricon, it only comprises of, I think, about 10 pages of the book. And it's only there as a bit of a device to demonstrate the greater principle that I'm talking about. I don't get into really close analysis on the level of many of my colleagues who have already done excellent work on something like demonstrating how much Plato is inspiring aspects of the Gospels, the Gospel of John, and as well as Paul. Obviously, I come with great respect to the tradition of scholars who have identified all the philosophical overlays with something like Paul, and I'm very interested in the work of colleagues who are doing more on philosophy in the Gospels. But I do tend to just kind of look in the broad scheme of things, in particular because I'm quite persuaded by the arguments of scholars like David Constant, who are trying to say that in the 2nd century, you have the emergence of what he calls the active reader. And so this is, whether you want to attribute it to sort of the quote unquote globalization of the empire and the increased literary exchange, increased financial means of, there isn't really a middle class in antiquity, but there is definitely an entrepreneurial class. We might say of merchants and you know, those who are making a great deal of money and have more ability for things like sending their children to paideia or engaging in literate culture in various ways. Trimalchio is one. He can't read, but he collects books and he engages in literate culture nonetheless. But we have increased evidence of that. And the Gospels in their register, we might say, of Koine Greek, and in some of their tropes and interests on that broad scale, like the Greek novel, are part of this emerging class of literature, including things like paradoxography, like the novel. The Gospels, I would say, are included, that are perhaps representative of the interests of a community, but one that's broad, that is part of this active reading class of emerging new readers in the 2nd century. So I do tend to lean more in that direction. And that's again also why I don't think of the Gospels as being by and for exclusive communal interests. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for this exchange. It almost exemplifies the scholars talking to scholars, isn't it, in a network over Zoom. So that's very encouraging. Dr. Anna Lefteratu, our lecturer in early Christianity.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation, and the book looks extremely interesting. I would like to read it. I have 2 small points from the point of view of the classes and the training, and a general methodological question. So the first small point is that the resurrection of Kalliroi in Comparative is not depicted as apotheosis, but as a rape. That she has been raped, says Keres, like other divine heroes, like other mythological heroes, like Orithia, or other people that just ran up to the air. So it is a kind of apotheosis, but not exactly the kind we find on in the Roman culture, like on the altar of Faustina. The question is that if you want to change the methodology about searching for communities with the idea of how do you look for the intended readership, which is the killer question in classics. So we do not know where they were written, the novels, we do not know who read them, but what was the intended readership? Will that change your outcome? Will that impact the way we understand the communities if you just rephrase them as potential readers?
I did not hear the beginning of the question. So let me repeat what I did hear to make sure that I got all, there's a bit of an echo in the room that's making it hard on my end to hear. But is the question of potential readers, is the idea that the potential readers would be Christian, and how does that change?
No, the idea is that if you transform your argument, and instead of searching for communities, or instead of deconstructing the communities, you start looking for potential readership. Will that give your argument a much broader reach of how you're going to shape that? So
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's just a matter of that the echo in the room is creating a little bit. Let me talk about, if it's about potential readership and how's that, sorry.
No, so I made some notes. So the first question was a remark on the nature of the resurrection, if it can be construed as an apotheosis. But the other point is, if it makes a difference, if we reconstruct the audience of a novel. So what do we know actually about the audience, the intended readership of a novel? Would it make a difference if we define it differently than a community? That's how I understood your question.
Communities, and you say we want to define John's community or Mark's community. If you define them as potential readers, will that not allow you to expand more? Because they would not be as localized.
Okay, so I heard words expand, more, localized. Okay, so I think I have an idea. So if we're thinking about the audience of the novel and constraint, let me just say one thing. This may not get at the question exactly, but let me just say that one principle of my critique of the idea of community is that the word community itself has a very difficult history, particularly within English, in terms of its associations with ideas of wholesale conversion and of national culture. And this is something that I can't recommend highly enough, the work of Stanley Stowers. He has an article on this called The Concept of Community in Early Christianity and Method and Theory in the Study of Religion. And it's an excellent article. I did not replicate the content of that article very much in the book itself, although I reference it. But there he gets much more into the word community and its implications, particularly within French traditions. And so I just wanted to raise that now. And again, I'm sorry because I was having some trouble with the audio to hear the question, but I did hear you talking about the idea of expanding perhaps, or ideas of potential readership or community. And I just want to raise that part of my resistance to the concept of community itself has to do with the word, whether we're applying it to Christianity or early Christianity and the groups we imagine are the audience for those texts, or more broadly. And so I do recommend that article to anyone who's interested. I do think that we can expand the potential audience for these early Christian materials beyond ideas of Christian groups, in particular because I think that these texts would have appealed for a number of reasons to persons in the 1st and 2nd century, based on other things that we know about interest in, for example, Judean material or Jewish material in the 1st and 2nd century. I can also recommend here the work of Jen Isle and Heidi Wendt on how Judean texts, things like the Septuagint, were of great interest beyond just Jewish audiences or what we might consider early Christian audiences, particularly perhaps after the war, which is something that I alluded to in the presentation. So I think that we can imagine, much like the novel, that these texts would have had great interest on a broad scale. I think our perception of them as quote unquote early Christian texts defined to a particular kind of group of people or social and historical context has a great deal to do with 2nd century quote unquote inventions of Christianity, specifically the codification of the canon over time and the search for texts that can be representative of some kind of Christian history, foundational Christian history, which is how Paul also enters into the picture. So Paul's established as a foundational figure, if by nothing else, by virtue of the fact that he wrote down his ideas and was one of the first ones to do so. And then the Gospels, particularly the Synoptics, I'm positing that they're evidence of literary exchange between authors, but the interesting functional thing about the fact that they all tell some version of a related story is that putting them together in the canon authorizes that particular narrative. So I think that there needs to be a distinction in our minds, between what happens to these texts in subsequent centuries as an authorizing narrative for early Christian history or the origins of Christianity versus what they may have, how they may have been produced in their first instance, which may have been much like the novel for a broader, expanded and less localized, quote unquote, group or a readership. Does that get at what?
Excellent, thank you so much. Let's take 2 questions from Zoom. First, Philip Lucien, followed by Rebecca Watts, and then we return back to the room. So if you can unmute yourself, Philip, and then Rebecca after the Q&A.
Yes, hi. Thanks for the fascinating presentation. I was wondering what you think about the work of Richard Bauckham. I was particularly put in mind of that when you were talking about the traditional view of New Testament scholarship of the Gospels as emerging from communities. And he too is very skeptical about that idea, but comes to his skepticism from a rather different angle and ends up emphasizing the Gospels as oral history, really, rather than the product of an oral tradition passed over, like the Chinese whispers you were talking about, which you experiment with in your classes sometimes, but rather as a product of a concerted effort to go to eyewitnesses and to record their accounts as faithfully as possible.
Yeah, I talk about him in the book, his work in the book, and I'm aware of it. I've read it, at turns, and his thesis is, as you say, in some ways congenial to my own to a certain extent. Although I find in his work, because he does try to tie, if I remember correctly, even the gospel names to specific eyewitnesses, and tries to attribute them that way. I've often found, and I don't like to speak ill of other scholars, but what I've found in his work is a bit of the adherence to some of those assumptions about the cohesion of early Christianity that I find difficult. And the actual, what would we say, the process that would be involved in achieving what he sets out as a historical circumstance for the projection of this literature seems to me to fall in line with some of those aspirational ideas of what the origins of Christianity must have looked like, or the security of something like a historical Jesus. And despite the fact that he talks about not oral tradition theory being passed on, but trying to go back to the specific eyewitnesses, it strikes me as a bit aspirational, and again, a little idiosyncratic, given what we know from the processes of other authors in the ancient world. So I do think that he still has a vision of early Christianity that I consider personally a little bit idealistic insofar as how cohesive he seems to think these groups would have been, or how reliable or how bounded. The idea of community still seems to be loom quite large in his work, from what I recall, in a way that I don't particularly subscribe to, because I tend to find just through the study of religion that early religious movements, new religious movements, tend to coalesce in a much messier way. And that particularly, again, back to what I find in the Gospels themselves, with evidence of engagement of literate culture of the time period, more evidence for literary exchange than I do evidence for eyewitness testimony. But I will preface again that I always want to make sure that it doesn't sound like I'm trying to dismiss everything that's ever happened in the field before me. I do think that it's possible that there are oral stories that are incorporated into these texts. I also think, back to my point about verse versus prose, the Magnificat, there could be elements of all of these texts that are more complicated than just they're quoting the Greek novel, right? Or they're just quoting the Septuagint. I do think that the fault lines are more complex than that. So I don't totally dismiss the idea of talking to some kind of, or engaging some kind of oral storytelling as part of the construction of these narratives. I would just like to revisit the degree to which we think that's a factor, and the historical circumstances that we imagine in the production of this literature, to just make sure we always have in mind. And I know he does make some claims about how eyewitness testimony was received, but I would just like to revisit the presumptions we have about cohesion when it comes to that kind of reconstruction of history. Does that?
Next question is from Rebecca Watts.
Hi, Robyn. I was delighted to hear your talk because my background was studying literature and language at St. Catherine's College in our wonderful Cambridge. So I like the focus on literary devices and strategy, and also your reference to literary theory, realism or structuralism. That's a fascinating thing. I want to think about perhaps literary theory in this era. But my question was, which you can read, how much have you considered earlier Jewish stories concerning known figures? For example, the Testament of Abraham, the Testament of Job, and these are perhaps earlier or contemporary with the stories written about Jesus of Nazareth, for presumably a Jewish, perhaps later Christian readership. So also seemed to me to be popular literature.
I think that is a wonderful question, and one that I only touch upon briefly in the book. There I talk about the work of Mimi Palmer Bonds, who wrote one book on Luke as epic, and she related it a bit to some of these other texts that we might consider part of more of a Jewish context. Because I was so determined in the book, you have to make choices about the direction you're going to go. I can't possibly deal with all literature, and I was trying to have this concerted effort to compare the Gospels to a broader range of Greco-Roman literature. I did not deal with those texts as much. Some of that was strategic, and some of that was to my mind, a certain degree of necessity. The strategic element was that for me to fall back on Jewish texts might fall into that what I consider a bit of a trap of, well, there is a very specific community for these texts. And I was trying to expand our view a little bit more. But I always envisioned that, or at least I hoped that someone would do that kind of comparison based on this book. And I may not be the person to do it, but I think it's something that should be done. Also, I had a great deal of difficulty trying to reconstruct the educational and publication processes of those we might consider coming from more of a Jewish background, other than someone like Philo or Josephus, which is particularly interesting. We know next to nothing about the processes of education for Pharisees, which is shocking, considering how much work has been done on Paul, Josephus as well. We just don't know enough. And so even things like literacy, I struggled a little bit. I had to use the work of Catherine Hetzler, but there was not as much out there as I would have liked. So in order to give a perspective on authorship in antiquity and those kinds of practices, I did end up having to use the work of primarily Greek and Roman writers to reconstruct that element of historical practice. And so because of that, that made it, when I say by necessity, just easier for me to then talk about Greco-Roman literature. But it also broke me out of that paradigm where I'm only thinking about, this is quote unquote Jewish literature or for a particular religious audience. Because back to what I was saying before, we do know quite a bit about the reception of, Judean sacred texts or Jewish sacred texts and subjects, both from literate culture and from non-literate culture. People were quite interested in these things, even if they weren't Jewish. They had quite a big circulation. Why would Paul appeal to any Gentiles in the first place if there wasn't already some interest in these materials? And he manages, like Philo, to make it palatable through the lens of Greco-Roman philosophy. But the claim of Josephus, Philo, and Paul is that, we had it first. Like whatever you think of Homer, of Plato, of these other figures, Moses did it first. So there's a great deal of interesting cultural exchange going on as well. But we know that Judeans are getting kicked out of Rome for interpreting dreams. And we know that there's interest in the sacred texts of the Judeans. Some have speculated that after the destruction of the temple, those books went into, into the Roman temple of spoils, of war spoils. So there's a great deal of interest, I think, in Judean material. It's not exclusive to Judean quote unquote communities or Jewish communities. So those texts, it would be interesting to think more about their circulation and their reception, because it would correspond very nicely to what I'm proposing here because of their subject matter. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you so much. We are very privileged to have Professor William Holbery with us today, back in town after he has attended all the seminars by Zoom from Chester. So William, over to you.
Thank you very much for this inspiriting talk, and I have deep sympathy with the whole project of locating the New Testament in Greek literature. But my queries and hesitations result partly from something you've mentioned yourself, that you didn't give so much attention to Jewish Greek literature. And I was really wondering if you could say a bit more about your reaction to Josephus. And the things in Josephus I was thinking of were, one, in the Antiquities, where he says he is reproducing the paredosis, which he knows of the events in the life of the Jewish people, and the paredosis obviously includes a good many things which are written sources, and it seems to me that this is one of the places which somewhat challenges the strong dichotomy between oral tradition and the association of the Gospels with that, and the written tradition, which or written work, which you're advocating. But I wonder if we should possibly pay a bit more attention to the idea of tradition as in this Jewish context, as incorporating both written and oral material. Josephus seems to indicate that. He also incidentally indicates some foci of literacy, another subject you talked about. I was thinking particularly of when he talks about village scribes.
Right.
And it's possibly that is sort of one concrete indication of the kind of foci of literacy that there might have been in the ambience of the teaching of Jesus. And connected with that, one might think of the critical tradition on the teaching of Jesus has included, for instance, assertions that there is poetry behind the teaching of Jesus. Being in this country, I think especially of C.F. Burney and his book in the last century, The Poetry of Our Lord. And then much more recently, Joachim Jeremias with his Reconstruction conjectural, of course, of the stressed poetic nature of so many of the sayings in the gospel tradition. Of course, you can argue about all this, but part of my main point was that people who accept this sort of mainstream critical tradition have nevertheless sometimes been ready to see aspects of it which are suitable, what I might call a combination of the oral and the written. And to finish up with that seemed to me to be strongly represented in this particular seminar in the 40s and 50s by Wilfred Knox with his book, The Sources of the Synoptic Gospels. You know, when he envisaged written sources at a very early date, but placing himself within the tradition of the form critics and building a lot on what Alberts and Dibelius and Bultmann had all admitted in different ways, that were sources put together before the Gospels as we've got them. I'm sorry, that's been a long question, but the sort of focus of it was really the Jewish aspect represented by Josephus and the possible combination of written and oral material in a tradition.
Yes, I think it's an excellent question. And, you know, again, that's why I've seen a few people describe my book as saying, you know, throw out oral tradition altogether. I just want to trouble it. And I want to reimagine those, again, fault lines, because I think that to just assume something like oral tradition, you know, even the chapter that was cut from the book was about Q and was about any evidence we may have for a written version of some kind of oral tradition, or how can we imagine this, and it ended up being cut because I'm not a Q scholar, so I didn't want to wade too deeply into this. But one of the premises I put forward there is that by the time we see these materials written, and this is what's interesting to me about the fall of the temple, it seems to be a different methodology and a different interest in terms of preserving some kind of, if we do imagine there's oral elements behind what is written, to preserve things in a different way, whether it's because of dislocation of war or for other reasons. That seems to me to be a rupture point, because otherwise, how do you explain that the Gospels don't appear until after that event? So I actually posit that perhaps Q is even post-war in that chapter. It got published elsewhere, but that is something that I've been thinking quite a bit about. And so I think that it's something also related to the idea of village scribes. William Arnall, Bill Arnall, has written quite a bit on this subject. He has Jesus and the Village Scribes. My concern is just that we always go back to what we know about the historical processes, to the extent we know them, of these kinds of elements of production. So my only contention with Bill Arnall, who in that book actually does a very nice job too of demonstrating how many of the presumptions we have about scribal activity and even about quote unquote mission come from perhaps German precedent, both in terms of method, but also in terms of historical nationalism. I think all of those things are very interesting to hold in tension. He actually talks about German missionaries reimagining their activity much like that of the evangelists, you know, and of the potential village scribes who are acting in sort of this like almost kind of you know, this way that they're trumping empire, you know, right. So he does some very interesting work in that book along those lines. But my problem is back to that figure I gave about literacy. Is a scribe really, you know, able to produce prose literature that constructs so many disparate elements of oral, of written, of, you know, allusions, of second sophistic, of, you know, novels, of sacred scripture? Are they able to really combine all of those things that seem to be elements, again, being taught in something like paideia versus being trained as a scribe, which is a very different thing. So that is where I start to just worry a little that we have a bit of a fantasy about the simplicity of authorship. And for me, it's a much more complicated thing. And Josephus certainly represents one of the pinnacles. Interesting thing about Josephus too is, you know, he comes from, I think his father was a Pharisee at one point. So back to this idea of what does that education look like? And it certainly seems to include quite a bit of Greco-Roman philosophy. You know, and even Paul is writing with the Septuagint in mind. He's not writing with Jewish texts in mind. So that's on my mind when I think about these issues. The translation issue from Aramaic is on my mind as well. We don't know enough about their training in other languages. So all of these things are just what I would want to explore in more detail than I have tended to see in scholarship that tends to take maybe one kind of comparative approach. The other scholar who came to mind when you were speaking for me is Richard Horsley, who in the 90s and early aughts spent a lot of time doing work on oral poetry and beat poets and doing comparative work along those lines. And he has a great interest in the idea of early Christianity being some, a trumping of empire or being subversive to empire. And I actually did take a seminar with him at one point. He was a visitor when I was a graduate student, and he did some very interesting work on trying to reconstruct maybe some of the poetry behind the text. All of that, I think these are fantastic projects if we ground them in the realism of authorship practices. So as long as that becomes the primary focus and not the presumptions about the cohesion of communities of the landscape of Christianity, then I think exploring those possibilities are fantastic. And I, again, think that it would be wonderful to see more work done on Jewish material specifically in relation to this question. If for no other reason, then of course it's a gap in my own scholarship because this book had a very targeted purpose, but also because we have relatively or comparatively little evidence for those processes among that group of people in the period in question. And I think there's some great work to be done there.
The questions are continuing to come in, but we are almost finishing. So I think alternating between room and Zoom, I think it's best to end on Zoom. So I've got a question from Dr. James Carleton Paget.
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating paper. I've just got a couple of questions. I suppose the first is, does your work in any way illuminate the extent to which the Gospels are so similar in their wording and structure? It's always seemed to me that we take for granted the fact that there is something that these relations are so close, but actually there is a sense in which it's rather peculiar. So I was wondering if your work sheds any light on that. And the other question relates really to the point you were making about the wide-ranging readership of these texts. I mean, why do you think it is that until we get to Celsus and then not really beyond him, do we have any interest on the part of a Greco-Roman writer in the Gospels? Remember Pliny says that he knows very little about Christianity and what he finds is really rather pathetic. Tacitus barely betrays any knowledge at all, Suetonius the same. If we had these elites, if these elites were doing the kinds of things you imagine, would we not expect a little bit more? Celsus is an erratic block, really. So that's the end. Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Sure. So I view the similarities between the Gospels as evidence of the competitive nature of authors and the competitive exchange of authors. So I, again, had this chapter on Q that I ended up removing from the book. And so, I don't dispute the idea that there may have been some kind of quote unquote source that was shared, at least, if not shared among them, something that they had in their purview. But I see more evidence here of authors reading accounts, much like I say in the 5th chapter of the book, we have multiple accounts of the life of Alexander. Here we have multiple accounts of the life of Jesus. And so I think that there is evidence here of looking at Mark, his esoteric take, that's a little bit, I would call it kind of novelistic. The reason I say esoteric is that, his Jesus kind of bounces around, very much an emphasis of wonder. I'm making an argument in the forthcoming book that it's actually based on Virgil. And so it's a bit of a parody of Virgil and concepts of wonder in Virgil. And then you see Matthew, if Dr. Roberts is right in the work that's forthcoming that I mentioned before, that it's a Stoic document, that's a very, very different take than just a strict biography of Jesus. And then Luke looks much more like a traditional Roman novel, including elements of things like shipwrecks and that kind of thing. So if you look at the structure and content of each gospel, I see them as manifestations of different interests in telling a story, but through very different means and manners. And so I see that as competitive exchange between authors, much like you see in the biography of other great statesmen in a competitive context among authors. As for why we don't see more evidence of these texts being read by Roman elites, cultural elites. This is what I'm writing about in the second book. So you have anticipated me very well, because it is not a question that I answered to my satisfaction in this book, and one that I think needs to be answered. The answer that I'm coming up with so far, to some extent, if I'm right about the Satyricon and its placement in the 2nd century, that's one explanation. The other explanation too that has begun to gain a little bit more steam, I think, within the field is that these texts are much later than we thought. We don't have many people speaking of them or evidence of them really to the 2nd century. So maybe they are not from the 1st. So that would be one other explanation. The explanation that I'm developing right now has a bit more to do with that concept of the active reader that I mentioned before, that the Gospels are arising in a period in which you have more interest in paradoxography, where you have more interest in things like the Greek novel. These are not necessarily the kinds of literature that we see truly elite, like senatorial Romans engaging. This is what Constant means by the active reader. There's this new emerging class. Again, I resist using something like middle class, but more of an aspirational class that's emerging, particularly in the 2nd century, that seems to be interested in other kinds of stories that are not just trying to, they're aspiring to the Virgils of the world, but not quite getting there. And so they're a different audience for this kind of text. And so I think, to put it plainly, and I'm still working on how to argue this in the book, this is kind of pop literature, or maybe kind of junk literature in the mind of elite senatorial, truly culturally elite Romans who see it as some kind of maybe fad, see it as some, per Pliny, right, per Celsus, see this as some kind of strange interest on behalf of people that they consider socially lesser than them. And so to engage it, if it's a bit of it'd be a bit embarrassing, right? Because this is the literature of the nouveau riche. This is not the literature of the established classes. These are the interests of the nouveau riche. And so I'm working on aesthetics of reception of literature and the imperial period. I'm working on how to imagine economic classes according to aesthetics, because I think that dictates a lot more what people read than something like economics. And so to the extent that this literature does seem to represent the interests of a nouveau riche, and you certainly see that kind of aspiration to the people about the people Paul's writing to, right? They're sponsoring him, they have kind of a curious interest. They're engaging monetarily, investing monetarily in these kinds of proposals that he's putting forth and interpretations he's putting forth. I think there's evidence there of this literature being popular literature or literature of the nouveau riche, which would have been something aesthetically not pleasing. So I've been looking a lot at Lucian as well, who engages Christianity quite a bit, but none of it is positive, right? Anything he says about anybody who dabbles in Christianity or about Christianity itself, it's not a positive view. So I do think this might be literature of the nouveau riche.
Well, thank you so much, Robyn, and also James. Time is clearly too short for all the questions, and that's always a very positive sign. But perhaps, Robyn, we can book you for your second book, or perhaps the draft of your second book, so that we can engage in fuller discussion. And luckily, this is the last seminar of term, so it means that you've given us food for thought for the entire term break. So we are very grateful. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. Sorry about the audio, having trouble with the audio in the room, but I appreciate all of the questions and the engagement. And certainly will make me a better scholar for the next book. And I'm always happy to return and engage such a lively group. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.